Hello again. I have an opportunity now to share a little bit with you about the impact of criminalization on women. I was asked to speak generally about Africa, but I think a lot of what I'm speaking about is going to be clouded by my own experience of working around this issue in Malawi. So I'm looking forward to hearing from those of you in the room about your own experiences in your own countries, and those, of course, who are following this on Facebook. I think a lot of what has been covered earlier today has talked about women and talked about how HIV specifically has an impact on women. It's come up again and again. And I think one thing that is clear is that HIV is gendered. Much like Hijin said that the law is not unbiased, HIV and the way it's played out in our lives hasn't been unbiased either. Women are the first to know of their status. We know this. They're disproportionately affected by HIV. 51% of all HIV infections globally, 56% here in Africa. They experience financial disparities. They experience intimate partner violence within their relationships. And these hinder their abilities to access critical health-saving services, sexual health services, HIV-related services, TB-related services. There's gender inequality in our education system. There's restricted social autonomy for women. Women still experience significant inequality before the law, and this is critical. It goes back again to what Justice Cameron was saying earlier, that there's often been misuse of the law, especially when it comes to HIV and AIDS. But not only there, women are still unable to own land or have challenges in owning land. It's only as recent as last year when Malawi changed the age of a child to 18, for example. So women continue to face extreme inequalities before the law, and this plays out in the inequalities that they have in general, because the law does say something. It says something about our society. Whether what it says works out or not, it does say something. So if our laws are unequal, then the inequality persists. We have harmful cultural practices that persist in many of our communities across Africa. And I know they differ, but at the core, there's this re-entrenchment of patriarchy, of power relationships. They also are sometimes practices that pose a risk for women. In Malawi, for example, we have something that's known as, it's sexual cleansing. And it happens after a woman's husband dies. It also happens after a man's wife dies, but not as often. And there's the belief that there's bad spirits that will attack the family and the fortunes of the family. And oftentimes the woman herself is a part of ensuring that she goes through this cleansing process, because it's a part of these cultural values that we cling so closely to. But these are practices that are supposed to be carried out without any form of sexual, no condom use. If there's a condom use, then it doesn't work. So Malawi was in the news when our so-called hyena, Erica Neva, carried out such practices on over 100 women and girls, allegedly for the girls' part. But we know that so many women are married so young that there were bound to be some girls amongst them. He was knowingly HIV positive. We have laws in Malawi to deal with this. We have a Gender Equality Act that speaks specifically to harmful cultural practices, and that draws from international law to create that provision. Erica Neva was convicted of harmful cultural practices. However, the backlash that's happened in that community because of the way the law is used as a blunt hammer to deal with a sensitive issue such as culture is that soon after that, when there was a sex for food scandal in that same community, nobody would come forward to give evidence against the chiefs, the custodians of culture. So this is just one of many ways that women experience violence, and particular violence in African countries, I think. They experience extreme levels of poverty, food insecurity, and women who experience violence are at a higher risk for HIV, and women who are living with HIV are at a higher risk for violence. What I found when thinking about or talking about HIV legislation or HIV-specific laws or criminalization is that we need to be asking the woman question. If we're going to be legislating around HIV and AIDS, then we need to have a very clear and representative figure at the center of the debate. Who are we talking about? Who are we drafting these laws for? Whether it's to protect or to prevent. Who is the face of HIV and AIDS in Africa? We know that it remains that of a woman. And although many times the language of proposed HIV legislation is usually gender neutral, the realities of the pandemic result in a complete feminization of criminalization. It's a woman who finds out about her status first. It's the woman who has that critical legal aspect of knowing that is usually at the core of many of these transmission, exposure, non-disclosure laws. And oftentimes these legislative measures are set out as being drafted or created to protect women, to prevent the spread of HIV, to protect the unborn baby. But we need to be more critical than that. We need to interrogate exactly how those protections would play out. If it's possible for you to be charged with a crime for breastfeeding a child, who are we really protecting? What are we preventing? Are we going to end stigma if we use the law in that way? I think the woman question also demands that we as lawyers critically rethink what is and is not reasonable conduct. What is reasonable expectations? What is reasonable understandings and beliefs when it comes to HIV and AIDS? I've used the term reasonable very deliberately because I know that when I went to law school, and I'm sure this is the same as other common law lawyers in the room, we thought of the reasonable man on the Clapham omnibus. I say, why don't we think instead about the reasonable woman on the local minibus, the taxi, the matatu? If 56% of our women are living with HIV and AIDS, then surely it is their perspective that we should be thinking of when we decide what is and is not reasonable. As opposed to this man on this Clapham omnibus, which doesn't exist really anymore, who is synonymous with the pinnacle of reason in humanity, this ordinary London transit rider, who thinks everything rationally, who acts rationally. Perhaps he also happens to be a man who's living with HIV now. But it's still completely far from our experiences. It's completely far from the experiences of many of the communities that we serve or that we want to serve. Right now, we have so much knowledge about HIV transmission, testing, treatment, adherence, viral loads, and so on. Language that will be unpacked by the scientific experts who are going to be in the room, and I very much look forward to updating my knowledge on this because the pandemic has changed so rapidly since I first started working on HIV and AIDS. We know so much more now than we did before. Our fears are different fears. Our understandings are different understandings. We no longer talk about it as a death sentence. Yes, people still talk about it as a death sentence, but those of us who have the power of knowledge, who have been empowered with knowledge, know that that isn't the case. So, decisions about what constitutes criminal conduct in the context of HIV and AIDS must build on these facts. So in a sense, I do agree with what Justice Cameron said earlier. Facts are power. Facts are important. But we need to go a bit beyond that, because facts are not enough without the voice of those who are most critically impacted and affected. If their voice is not included in the policy and in the lawmaking, then we end up with something that does not speak to anybody except that strange man on that old Clapham omnibus. For me personally, the women in my life and the ways that their lived realities played out opened up my eyes to the particular impact of HIV criminalization on women. My aunt died of HIV and AIDS. Well, she died of AIDS. And at the time that she fell ill, in Malawi, there was a lot going on about being healed through the TV. You put a glass of water next to the TV, the pastor on TV will pray for it, and you're healed. I know that some of that, or things like that, still happen. And belief and believing in something higher than you, believing in the power of a cure, it's critical, it's important. She stopped taking her ARVs at that time because of a belief like that. Her background was one of violence, a violent relationship. She was brutally beaten up by her husband time and again, in full view of her children, at one time even myself. When she died, she was mentally unstable. She was alone. She had been thrown out by her husband. Her daughter from that marriage had died. And for me, she's the person that I think about when I read a piece of legislation that purports to protect or prevent, to protect people from HIV or somehow prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS. What would the law have done in her instance? What good is the law in the privacy of our bedrooms between two supposedly loving individuals in that quiet time when transmission takes place? How is the law going to change social actions when the law is such a blunt tool that really ought to be left for the most heinous and most criminal acts? So we need to ensure that women's voices, particularly the voices of those women who are living with HIV, are deliberately, and I use the word deliberately, that they are deliberately incorporated into the lawmaking process. They know the best about their lives. They know the most about their lived experiences. They bear the understanding of the times when they will come into that intersection with systems, whether it's the health system, the criminal justice system. I mean, we heard it so clearly earlier when the nurse from Uganda was talking about how she was doing a job that she had done well for so very, very many years. She did her job carefully. She did her job with care for her patients. And still, misunderstanding, misuse of the law, coupled with stigma, was able to pull her out of her cherished career for no reason whatsoever. So-called legislative management efforts often have the effect of infantilizing, criminalizing, stigmatizing, and victimizing women, especially women who are already living with HIV. If she had been tested and tested negative, perhaps there would have been a small story about, oh, don't be careless, but it would have ended there. Rather than being protective and preventive, these laws are paternalistic, making women out to be victims, the innocent woman in her relationship who was infected by her husband, or vectors, the callous woman who breastfed her child and didn't care that she was HIV positive. It demonizes and infantilizes women. They're painted as carriers of the disease, but also callous and careless mothers, or women of loose morals, the shame around sex. And this is happening in countries where most of our young women are married at a very tender age, oftentimes before the age of 18. And in those relationships, oftentimes violent relationships, they become infected or they learn of their infection. And so lives that are already fraught with violence become even more fragile. In reality, women who are living with HIV rarely describe themselves as victims when they're talking about how they became infected. So that kind of language, it erases all agency of the individuals involved. And as for the language of vectors, that's especially harmful for those who are most marginalized. Women, such as female sex workers, for example, or transgender women. Later on, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the specific activism and work that we did around the HIV and AIDS bill that is now law in Malawi. The most powerful part of that whole process was when we handed over the legal knowledge that we had as activists, and Chikondi mentioned it a little bit earlier, to the women, the rural, actually largely rural women activists who had come to attend the meetings. They were women who have been living with HIV and AIDS, and they were out and open and willing to talk about it. This was their reality. For some of them, for over 20 years. They stood in the room with a group of parliamentarians who were trying to explain to them how the law that they had crafted was going to be protective of them and to protect their unborn babies from HIV. And the one woman stood up and she said, before you care about the baby in my womb, I care about this baby. I particularly like that baby example because that's largely the way that women find out about their HIV status when they go for antenatal care. So they're the first to know, which I said earlier is at the core of a lot of these non-disclosure, exposure, or transmission offenses. And then they become criminals under HIV-specific laws that explicitly or implicitly forbid them from being pregnant or from breastfeeding in case they transmit the virus to the unborn child. We have examples of mandatory testing or treatment provisions that are particularly crafted around HIV, women who are living with HIV. I'm sorry, Annabelle, I can't scroll here. I can't. No, I wanted to scroll here. Anyways, thank you. Yeah. It's not really responding. Thank you, that's better. Provisions like those infantilize the pregnant woman by coercing her to undergo testing and take medication. And they presuppose that these are choices that she would not make if she was offered the same freely and with a request for her consent. But the truth is that most women want to protect their babies. They want to have their babies born HIV-free, and they want to live. Attaching a criminal sanction or coercion doesn't actually promote healthier outcomes for any woman. Instead, it devalues their lives. It devalues the life of the mother in favor of the baby being born HIV-free. What we argued was, why don't you protect the health and well-being of the mother to ensure improved outcomes for the health and well-being of the child? And as has been pointed out here today, that perhaps there are times when we need legislation. There are public health implications to a pandemic, and we need to know about what our government is doing, and we want to know that our government is doing something. Perhaps legislation can be used to set out the manner in which voluntary counseling and testing or partner notification takes place, although partner notification is also very highly problematic. But criminalization, instead of helping in a public health sense, instead of bringing us towards that idea of ending HIV, as some partners here asked about earlier, it takes us backwards. It makes it so that people who are living with HIV, or those who think that they might be at risk or who have the perception of being HIV positive, shun the very services that would save their lives and save the lives of the entire community. So the public health intentions are lost when we create a situation where knowing your status makes you into a criminal. And the first one to know their status, of course, is a woman. So it would create a situation where women become criminals. We need to be clear that if we want to reduce the spread of HIV by reducing stigma, then persecuting people who are living with HIV is not the way. And I just wanted to end with this. I thought it was quite empowering because of the word empowering. The idea that when HIV and AIDS travels along the fault lines of society, it reveals deeper structures of power and provides an opportunity for us to challenge them. And I think that that's the work that we're engaging in here today, and I hope that that's the work that we're constantly engaging in, challenging the power structures. But what it also does, it reveals the importance of empowering women themselves across their lives in order for sustainable and effective response to HIV and AIDS. Right now we have an HIV law in Malawi that doesn't have any of those horrible provisions that really posited women as being unable to control anything about their own sexual health or the sexual health of those around them and those they love, particularly their unborn children. It was an aspect of that societal control that Hei-Jin mentioned earlier. The same kind of control over women's bodies, women's lives, women's sexual, especially their sexual reproductive health, that we've seen played out in previous and older laws and legislation. The only way that we stopped that in Malawi was by empowering women who are living with HIV, who didn't necessarily have the legal knowledge that we as lawyers had, to understand in reading a piece of legislation what the implications would be if a provision talks about exposure or transmission in such an overly broad manner, then any action that you take, for example, spitting or breastfeeding your child, becomes a potentially criminal one. So the importance really lies in empowering women. I'd like to end there. Thank you.